Hi there. Thank you, Courtney. And thank you, Tatiana, for an unbelievably ear-opening thing, because I couldn't actually see, I was just listening, but it was pretty awesome. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. So, I'm Jason Pamental, and I spend a lot of time talking about fonts, so I'll just let you know now, that's kind of my thing. But this talk is actually going to be about a lot more than just typography. It's actually going to be about a lot of interesting CSS things that I've been learning, that I've been trying to use in combinations. So we're actually going to be talking about a whole bunch of other new CSS techniques and how to start to incorporate those things into your daily life. So what do? I walk my dogs. That's pretty much why anybody would really know me if you follow me on social media. That's Tristan on the left and his cousin Tilly on the right. And they'll be back to actually help explain a few things as well later on. So when I'm not walking the dogs, I tend to be spending a lot of time helping other companies and teams use fonts better, whether it's from a branding perspective, trying to figure out how to represent your voice better online, for performance, how to implement web fonts better so you get less lag and quicker content on screen, or really just trying to figure out how to start to incorporate newer technologies into production environments in a sort of safe and predictable and manageable way. But stepping back and trying to figure out why, this is the reason. Most of what goes up on the screen in an app or on a website is text. And that text has a tone and a sound and a feeling to it, and that is represented by the font. So, in effect, it is one of the most prevalent aspects of user experience, but it's one that is intimately tied to technology. You can't really separate how you set it up. And so, while I'm going through this, some of you will notice that this is running in a browser. So everything that you're seeing here is actually all set in variable fonts and running in Firefox. It's just a regular build, it's nothing special, other than the fact that it's Firefox and it's awesome. And I'll show you a little bit about the dev tools and things like that that really sort of separate this. But this quote kind of floated across my Twitter feed the day before I was about to give a talk in Melbourne earlier this year at Web Directions. And this really kind of stopped me in my tracks. I mean, I know Nina, and she's a phenomenal educator. She's a really talented designer. And this really got me thinking about what is it about type that is so special, at least to me, in that it helps add the friction, it stops you, it grabs your attention. There's something about that surface between you and the text and the experience of what you're looking at, but it can't add too much friction or you won't be able to understand it. So there's this tension just inherent in the typography itself, typography that's meant to be read and typography that's meant to get your attention. And those are two different goals, and I've written about that quite a bit in a newsletter that I do on web typography every week, and really tried to kind of explore this. So we're going to look at both of these things and how we might start to do them a little bit differently when we're designing and developing things for the web. So there's three things together that I really wanted to talk about. Variable fonts, which is a new font technology, CSS custom properties, or CSS variables, and calculations in your CSS. So those things together open up some really interesting possibilities. So when we look at this, and because this is a weird and long and tortured journey, I thought the Odyssey might actually be a good way to illustrate this, so I'm going to come back to this quite a bit. We have a heading, and instead of just setting that in a color, we might set it as a custom property that we can start to change. And so when we just change that variable, whether it's through JavaScript or a subsequent page load or other kind of user interaction, then we can start to impact little elements at a time without rewriting a lot of HTML or CSS. But we can also do that with size and start to bring in the notion of a calculation. Now, CSS calculations and custom properties are really well supported. Shocker, except in IE 11. There's ways around it, but generally speaking, everything I'm going to be showing you today will actually work in every shipping browser right now, except for maybe the UC browser or a couple of other Android ones. But generally speaking, for the broadest part of your market, these things are all pretty safe to put into practice. So we can start to change a custom property under certain circumstances and alter the size of the typography, starting to bring these things into combination. We're writing less code as we go into each of these different areas. We can also start to use variable fonts to change things like the font weight. So now we start to bring in these things in combination and using them in ways that will actually start to multiply the effects that you can have. And when we start to do that, we can then see how it applies across a design system. So one of the things about design systems that I think is really an important concept is, not only as Tatiana mentioned, it is something that helps kind of multiply the effect of any given component, for good or for bad, but it's something that allows you to go back to that one place to fix it. So that's really powerful. And it also gives you the ability to then start to use these things in different ways as they move around. So we've got this kind of typical page where you've got a larger content area and then these small teasers. If we start to use these variables in these components, as they move and they get scoped into different areas of the layout, then you can start to impact them with very little code. So you're just really altering maybe one or two things. Everything's scaling together based on where you put it in the layout. So rather than necessarily having to be incredibly verbose and specific about every single component, some of these components can start taking their cues and layout based on where they're placed on the page. So what about that stuff, that variable font bit? So how many people here have used a variable font, or at least know what they are? Well, that's a very small number. Okay, so here's what's so great about them. How many people have loaded fonts before on a website? Right? So pretty much everybody. And you know that you have to load a specific file, or 4 files, depending on how thorough you're going to be, to get every single weight and variant. So bold, italic, regular, bold, italic. If you want that for your content management system, you're loading 4 different files. Each of those has a cost in file size, in latency, and HTTP requests. So if we could bring those all into one file, that's going to be interesting. It's not going to be as small as a single weight file, but it's going to be much smaller than all of those separate ones. So when you have an example like a full family of something like FF Meta, might be 18 or 36 different files to get all the different weights, the italics, different widths. Those can all be represented in a single file. That single file might be only 100K, 150K. They get better as they get optimized. And that gives us a tremendous range in our design language and our voice that we didn't have before. So when somebody says good design and good typography is about only using 3 or 4 weights of a typeface, that's not true. That might be better for performance, but that's not necessarily great typography. Modulating the weight of your bold headers at every physical size at which it's represented is going to be more legible, but we've never been able to do that on the web because of the performance cost. This allows us to do that. So we'll illustrate this again with the help of Tristan and Tilly. So when we take a look here and we think about width, and we might have another axis for weight, or even X height. And of course, we might also have slant. All of those things can be contained in a single file, and then accessed via CSS, and animatable as well, as you can see. So all of those things give us tremendous design possibilities and voice without having to load additional assets. Now, that also then can enable us to combine all of the things we were talking about CSS variables and calculations, to actually take that whole system and scale it, and rather than doing it at fixed breakpoints, use the calculations to let the math tie into the size of the viewport. So when we start to look at this on a phone, and we start to layer in all of these CSS variables, we can then tie them into something that uses viewport units to start to respond to the size of the screen. So We have the calculations in here to set font size and line height at a small size. But you might have noticed there, I'm going to go back and show this again, watch what happens with the type size and the line height, the distance between the lines. As that changes, it gets bigger. Because as the line length gets longer, you need more space between the lines to get to the end of one line to get your eye back to the beginning of the next. That's something that is tied into the formulation and the design of a paragraph. Text size, the space between the lines, and the length of the line are all tied. So 3 parts of a triangle that need to be in balance when you're designing your typography. But we can throw a formula in here like this, and this came from something that Tim Brown wrote about, and actually there was somebody else that had pioneered this previously, and I'm totally drawing a blank on his name, but that formula allows us to tie in a low-end breakpoint and a high-end breakpoint and say start scaling from here, stop scaling there, use math in between. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more in detail in a moment. But by using this for as soon as you turn your phone sideways all the way up to a large desktop screen, we can actually have smooth scaling typography across our entire design system that will work on any device size in between. And that's really powerful. So here's that formula. So it's doing a calculation, and one of the things, no, I can't actually explain all of it, but if you take a look at that link, and all of this stuff will be up on Noticed afterwards. I'll have a link in the last slide. It's already posted. The HTML and CSS of the slides are already embedded there, so you'll be able to come back and take a look at it really easily. This is it in prose. So please scale from this size to this size on this size screen to this size screen. That's really all it's doing. And the nice thing is, once you write that formula once, you can make it a mix-in, you could make it whatever you want, and then just throw that in to scale line height, to scale text size. There's an evolution to the CSS specification for calculations that I don't think is implemented in browsers yet, but it will be relatively soon, that will let you get a unitless value at the end, which is what you need to do things like scaling text weight. So if you wanted to have the weight of your headers actually scale with the size that they're represented, you could do that too. Currently, you could do that with JavaScript. Mandy Michael actually has a really great example on CodePen about that. I'll make sure that's linked in the resources on Noticed as well. But the idea is browsers are good at doing math, and they can mix different units. So you can use viewport units multiplied with ems or rems or pixels to end up with a scaling unit end result in that calculation that works really well, far better than I can do it myself. So with that system in mind, we can put all of this together and tie in. Now, if you notice here, look at the width of the text in the header and on the body copy. What's happening here is I've narrowed the width of the characters ever so slightly so that I can have more characters per line to create more readable text. It's a smoother reading experience for the end user because they can get a better rhythm as they're reading. But when the screen gets bigger, you probably want to go back to the standard width of those characters. Well, we can scale all those things together using this same kind of system. So as it goes from small screen to big one, the heading text got wider, the body text went back to 100%, we have a longer line length with more line height, and the text size itself scales up a little bit. So we create a reading environment that's appropriate to the device, to the distance from your face. So that's really important. A phone you hold here, a desktop screen is up there. And that makes a better reading experience without having to write any more code. And we can really be adaptive based on user intent. So that's how all of this stuff fits together. I've got tons of examples of this on CodePen and up on GitHub, so there's plenty of code for you to play around with. Here's a little bit of it in action. So this is a page that I wrote and designed for Monotype for the launch of FF Meta last year. And this whole thing is actually running as an embed and is also up on CodePen. And you can see that that scales pretty nicely. But I'm going to back up a second here and actually scroll so you can see the whole thing. Because not only do I kind of like the writing, but I like the design as well. But it's important to point that out. All of this is done with a single 84K file. Now that was pre-release and it was a slightly reduced character set, but I have the near final production ones, and once that's been subset to a Latin 1 extended character set and made useful for the web, it's about 120K. And it also has a width axis in the production version as opposed to this one that only has weight. So about 100K to swap out for 800 or 900K of regular font files. It's pretty incredible. Now, the performance argument is you want less download, so one asset is better. 120K is sometimes objectionable, but I think it's pretty reasonable for what you get for that asset. The design possibilities are nearly limitless, so we really get to do an awful lot. And then as that moves around and scales, we're tying into viewport units, so things are scaling pretty nicely there. One note about viewport units for text: don't ever use them alone. Because when you just use a viewport unit to size your text, the user can't resize it. As you zoom in, it's still based on the viewport, so it's a real accessibility nightmare. But as soon as you multiply even by 1 pixel, it will then result in something that is zoomable for the user. So just a little side note there to keep that in mind. Now, Tim Brown, somebody I've quoted before with that formula, wrote a wonderful book called Flexible Typesetting for a Book Apart. And I thought this was a really important thing for us to keep in mind. Because as I'm sort of getting into some of these other things that I'm going to show you, this is really about giving the user control. All of those things that I was mentioning about how you scale everything, it all still works when you scale things based on your own preferences. And what we want to do is provide a good suggestion for that reading experience without sacrificing what the user themselves can do to make it just right for them. This is a fairly decent-sized crowd, and based on averages, there's a significant percentage of people here that have different kinds of issues with their ability to take in information. So there's bound to be some people who are colorblind. I see lots of people with glasses. I don't see that many people as old as I am, but my eyes are starting to have some issues with really close up or really far away. So all of those things add up to my needing to tailor my own reading experience. So as we start to do these things, we might want to tie into other features that people are talking about. So reversing the contrast in text. Before I move ahead, what I want to show you here is if I go into the Mac OS System Preferences under General, they have Appearance, Light and Dark Mode. Now, a lot of applications have been updated to work with this, and there's now also a media query that's supported in, might be all 3 of the major browsers. I'm not sure if Chrome has shipped it yet, but I know they're about to if they haven't. It's in Firefox and in Safari, so that we can tie into that preference. So based on using CSS variables to assign colors, it makes it really trivial for us to put in a media query block that not only deals with the preference in the user, but also tailors the typography as well. So what's happened here, now I'm going to switch this back because I cheated it a little bit and added a CSS class as well, but we have some initial settings in the typography. So there's background color, and text grade. Now, text grade is one of the variation axes that's starting to become a little bit more common, that is effectively like making the text a little bolder without changing the overall metrics of the space that it occupies. So if you think about a UI animation or just adding a little bit more contrast to the text without having everything reflow, that's what the grade axis is for. Now, a note about these axes. They're what the type designer intends. They're not a browser interpretation. So not every typeface has every axis, and not every axis is going to have the same range. But that's what's beautiful about type design. Every type design is going to be a little bit different, and it gives us different things to play with. So grade is one, and this particular one is Roboto Delta, which you can get on GitHub. It's a variable version of the Roboto typeface, so it's pretty common. And what that allows us to do is increase the grade just a little bit and increase the letter spacing just a little bit. Because when it gets a little bit heavier grade, and also with that reverse contrast, to be more readable, you probably want to space it out just a little bit. But you'll notice that that prefers color scheme media query is really simple. And using CSS variables means all we have to do is reassign a couple of values. We don't have to rewrite a whole lot of code. So I added this to my own website, and it only took me about 10 or 15 minutes. So just as an experiment to see how that works, if you go to rwt.io and then change the setting in your own OS, then you should see the color contrast reverse. And if it breaks, which it probably does somewhere, then just tweet me and let me know. So the other reason we might use grade is actually for people with low vision. So this is where my eyes are headed. I mean, after 30, it's downhill from there. So anybody else, this is what you have to look forward to. But what happens is you start to need a little bit stronger contrast. So if we can, again, change the grade of the text, it creates just that little bit stronger contrast. So we've increased the grade and the letter spacing just a tiny little bit and then made a stronger difference in the background color to foreground color to create that user option. Now, these things are really simple in and of themselves, but we want to make sure that we can expose them to the end user. Now, things like text size used to be fairly common in websites, and then page zoom started to work better, so people put that in their websites less. But oftentimes, you don't really need to scale the whole layout. You just want to make it a little bit more readable. So using, again, these CSS custom properties, you can start to expose some of these controls, use a little bit of JavaScript, and make it available to the end user. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Now, this looks a little weird, maybe, but there's a certain subset of people who have dyslexia that suffer from something called crowding. Now, crowding is just that. Everything kind of comes together, and it decreases your ability to take in that information. But Microsoft did a great talk about this and pointed out some research that showed if you could increase the word spacing and line spacing, you could increase reading comprehension in that subset of users by as much as 50%, 50. That's a tremendous benefit for adding 1 or 2 lines of CSS. So maybe that's not something you want to have for everybody, but if you expose these things in a little accessibility panel and let people choose for themselves what they need in order to get something out of your content, that's incredibly powerful. And we want to talk about being inclusive. We need to be inclusive of people with all kinds of issues. And this is not really a whole lot of effort. So I have a little example here. So we could just add all of those things just with a class and then maybe use JavaScript to store the preferences from one page to the next. So we could actually just give people a little toggle to choose the things that they need and then go about their business. So, I mean, again, this is a tiny bit of HTML and CSS and JavaScript that enables a whole other subset of users to get more out of this content. And if the whole reason that I put this content up there is so that people can read it, it kind of behooves me to make them able to do so. So this is about making that better suggestion, giving people some additional tools. The net cost of this for us as developers and for owners of these systems, it's effectively zero. Because it's going to take a couple hours of time, a little bit of Q&A, you roll this thing out, and you improve the lives of massive numbers of users. Because even if you have a relatively small amount of traffic, if 5% more people can actually make use of it, that's tremendous. That's a really big number. So keep those things in mind. And make sure that when you're building your next system, when you think about what these variables can do when you're starting to incorporate that into your work, think about how we might be able to make that whole system a little bit more flexible. And then you can extend it even further. I mean, none of these things are useful only in isolation. Using the same ideas about these variables that ripple across a whole system can allow you to change the layout, but also change the entire theme. I mean, what if we actually even not only set our grid values this way, but set our typography stack that way? So that way, you could change the whole thing just by changing a couple of variables. So we change the font stack, we change a few font size values, change a little bit of layout stuff, and we can actually have all kinds of fun. So this is the exact same HTML, but a few changes in layout, a few changes in text size, and we just make something a little bit more interesting. So that means that our code can then travel more. So as developers, we're going to be doing things on multiple sites and multiple projects. By making that core code that much more flexible, you can really get a lot more out of it. Now, this is taken a big step further in a project that I was working on for the state of Georgia back in the US. So it's one of the 50 states, and they have over 100 different websites serving millions of citizens. And so we worked on a design system. This is all based in Pattern Lab, and here is the Pattern Lab, that takes all of these ideas and puts them into production using static web fonts for browsers that don't get it, for IE11, and then uses @supports to gate off the variable font stuff with all the dynamic text sizing for all the browsers that can see it. So everybody gets the whole thing. And if I flip over to this other window here, they've launched over 20 websites, and everybody gets to go in and change their content, change the basics of the layout, but it's using the whole system, and the citizens themselves get something that's way more consistent. And then again, if I start to resize this, you'll see all the text, everything is resizing in the same manner. So this is absolutely safe for production. It's in use by millions of people every day now. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, implementation of variable fonts to date. So it was really very exciting to see all of this stuff actually come to life. And coming back here, there's a couple other companies that you might have heard of that are starting to dabble with this. So IBM is not small, and in their Carbon design system, they introduced the Plex family of typefaces of 2-3 years ago. Just a few months ago, they released a variable version of Plex Sans. Now, 233K is not even the best that they can do. That's a full character set of hundreds of glyphs. Most people who are only working on websites that might be a Western language only need Latin 1 extended. That's only 400 or 500 glyphs. Those files could be even smaller. If you only need upright characters, again, it's 2 files. The upright are in one, the italics are in the other. It's about 110K. I'm working with Monotype on some of their other font releases, and they've got Avenir coming, they've got FF Meta with width, they've got Univer, they've got a bunch of other really interesting, really production-ready, classic brand typefaces. Avenir being one I'm working with one of their clients to look at that. And it's less than 100K for the file that they need that replaces 150K and 6 files with 1. So they're going to have tremendous design possibilities with that. So these are not small companies. They're multi-million-dollar e-commerce companies. They're one of the largest tech companies in the world. But in the last couple of minutes before I run out of time, I wanted to show you something else that I'm involved in right now that's really exciting. I became an invited expert on the W3C's Web Font Working Group. And just with regard to the performance bit, what I wanted to show you is what we're working on is called progressive font enrichment. And it's something that I wrote about a little while ago. If you Google that, you'll be able to find the write-up on it. I also list it in the resources. And what this is going to do is allow us to take the page that you're looking at and have the server dynamically subset the font to only serve the glyphs that you need to render that page and have it all happen on the fly. But when you go from one page to the next, it will only then download the additional font data that you need and patch together the subsequent file. So that's really pretty powerful stuff, and it's always better when you show a live demo, because that's not risky at all. So what I'm going to do is take one paragraph from the first book of the Odyssey. I'm going to go over to this demo, and again, the link will be present for this. We're going to use the font tool subsetter. A note on this. This is very beta. This is a research tool for us to start to experiment with things. Don't expect it to be pretty, but it works really well. So we're going to clear stuff out here. So I'm going to clear the demo content. I've made some choices. I chose a variable font. I'm using the highest quality setting for this broadly shared dictionary, the font tool subsetter for reasons, I'm going to retain the glyph IDs, and I'm going to patch in this text. I'm going to hit add. There. So what you're seeing here is the top line is the whole font, one of the bottom lines is what's getting served right now. And the one that we're looking for is the WAF2 segment on the line B. So it served 10K of font data in order to render that paragraph. Now, what we're going to do is go select the rest of the text. So that was one paragraph. And we're going to go down here and we're going to get all of this text. Copy that. Bring it back in here. And add that to our demo. It added 7.8K to render about 50 times as much text. So this is a pretty rough demo, but when you figure that the font file is probably going to be more like 100K, and then you're only going to render 10K of that, and then maybe 2, and then 5, and then 7 on every subsequent page load, the performance question goes away. It doesn't matter how many fonts you're going to load because you're never going to be serving more than a tiny amount of data on each one of them. That's great for Western languages, but think about Arabic, where the average font file size might be 2.5 megs. Or think about CJK, Chinese, Japanese, or Korean, where the average font file might be 16 to 20 megs. That's the difference between having good typography and fonts and not. So when you think about that use case, when we talk to people at the BBC or talk to people in other news services or e-commerce platforms like Alibaba, this is the opportunity to improve the ability for people to read the content without sacrificing the end user experience. So those things are all really important, and I just noticed that I'm totally over time. I hope you will excuse me, and I apologize for the next speaker, so I'm going to have to wrap this up. But anyway, that stuff, it's really fun, it's really exciting. That's really not the right window. Oh, it is. I forgot, that's my slide. So that's sort of how it works. This is probably a year or two away from actually happening. We're actually having our first face-to-face meeting in Tokyo in about 2 months to keep working on this stuff. We have sort of like weekly calls, but Google's involved, Monotype's involved, Apple, Adobe, like all the major companies are involved in contributing their patents to this. I mean, they're really serious about making this happen. So it is definitely something that you'll be able to see coming soon. This is a list of the different typefaces that I use and where you can find them. You can find a lot of stuff on vfonts.com. That's a great catalog of variable fonts. A lot of these things are actually open source. You can find them on GitHub. Thank you very much. If you're going to take one photo, appreciate the dogs. Yes, get that link down at the bottom. You can sign up for a newsletter and learn more about web typography every week. And ask me lots of questions on Twitter because I'd love to talk to you about it. Thank you very much, everyone.